Clara didn't cry when her father traded her to the Apache chief, not because she was brave, but because the shame had dried up every tear long before that day. She stood silent as the fire cracked between them, her plain dress clinging to her bony frame, her unkempt hair casting shadows over the crooked nose her stepmother always mocked, while the men spoke about her like she was a mule, not a daughter. "She's strong, doesn't complain, and I've got 5 more mouths to feed," her father had said, and Chief Taza, broad and silent, gave only a nod in return before throwing down a bundle of pelts and horseshoes to seal the exchange. Clara didn't know Apache customs, but she knew she wasn't being stolen. She was being given away like a broken toy no one wanted, and that kind of rejection burns deep into a girl's chest. She expected to be dragged off or beaten into obedience, but Taza did nothing. He just handed her a blanket and gestured toward his horse with something close to gentleness. On the trail, he rode ahead, never looking back, and Clara followed behind, numb, her mind spiraling into memories of her father's disgust, of townspeople whispering that no man would want her, of little children giggling when she walked past with her slumped shoulders and sallow skin. Yet, with each mile into the desert, something strange stirred. Not fear exactly, not hope either, but a sharp awareness that she had finally left behind everyone who'd ever told her she wasn't worth loving. When they reached a quiet clearing by a creek at sunset, Taza stopped, dismounted, and looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. And the quiet in his gaze unnerved her more than any slap would have. Clara stood there, clutching the blanket, and whispered, "Why didn't you say anything?" And though he didn't answer, he knelt and began to build a fire between them, not for control, not to intimidate, but to keep her warm, and something in her chest, long frozen and coiled, shifted ever so slightly toward life. Clara had expected rough hands, and orders barked in a tongue she couldn't understand, but instead she found herself waking to the smell of roasted corn and the sound of water flowing just beyond their camp. And when she sat up beneath the woolen blanket, she saw Taza already up, kneeling beside the creek, washing a strip of deer meat with slow, practiced movements. He looked up once, met her eyes, and nodded. Not commanding, not dismissing, just acknowledging her. And it felt so strange that Clara looked away, ashamed of how her heart reacted to the first hint of human decency in years. Back home, even her little brothers mimicked their father's sneers, calling her crow-face when Ma wasn't listening. And now here she was with a man her people called a savage, but who hadn't once raised his voice or hand. Later, as they traveled deeper into the hills, she began to notice how others looked at Taza when they passed through small Apache settlements, some with respect, some with fear, and she realized he wasn't just any man, but someone who carried weight, someone others followed. They spoke few words, mostly gestures and glances, but there was no cruelty in his silences, only patience. And when she stumbled crossing a stream, he caught her by the arm and steadied her, firmly but gently. And Clara found herself blinking back a sob, not from pain, but from how foreign tenderness felt. That night, he handed her a woven pouch filled with herbs and motioned for her to place it under her sleeping mat. When she looked confused, he simply murmured, "Dream good," in broken English, and that small kindness shattered something in her. For the first time since her mother died, Clara let herself cry, not from rejection, but from the aching realization that this man, who owed her nothing, treated her like a person with worth. She didn't understand what she was to him. Not a wife in the way her people meant it, and not a slave either. And as she lay beneath the stars, she wondered what kind of man accepted an unwanted girl as a gift, and yet asked for nothing in return, and why, in the presence of such a man, she felt more seen than in her whole life back home. The days grew warmer, the path rougher, but Clara's legs grew steadier, and by the end of the first week she no longer stumbled behind Taza. She walked beside him, sometimes close enough to catch the scent of pine smoke in his braids, sometimes falling just behind to watch how confidently he moved through land that seemed to breathe with him. She didn't speak much, still unsure whether she was allowed to, but he had begun pointing out herbs, naming animals in his deep, measured voice, and showing her which berries not to eat. One afternoon, as they passed a ridge of red stone, they encountered a rider, Apache but younger, cocky, and armed with a bow slung low across his back. Clara didn't catch the full conversation, but the boy's tone was mocking, his gaze flicking to her with a smirk, and then back to Taza with a question that needed no translation. Clara's stomach twisted when the youth laughed, ugly, sharp, and muttered something as he rode away, but Taza didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply stood there a moment longer, his jaw tight, and then resumed walking. That night, as they camped beneath a ledge, Clara finally asked, "Do they think I'm your punishment?" And her voice broke before she could stop it. Taza looked at her for a long time, then reached into his satchel and pulled out a carved wooden comb, placing it in her hands. "My mother made for wife," he said slowly, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "But she never come back. She die before I marry." Clara stared at the comb, its smooth curve fitting her palm like it had waited years to be held, and she felt her throat tighten as something old and bitter inside her cracked open. "You could have refused me," she whispered, not looking up, but Taza answered simply, "Your eyes were sad." "I do not turn away sadness." That night, as she ran the comb through her tangled hair beneath the firelight, Clara didn't feel pretty. Not yet. But she felt like maybe, just maybe, being ugly was never the real reason no one had stayed. Maybe no one had known how to see her. Until now. The first time Clara laughed, it startled them both. She had tripped on a root while gathering firewood and landed in a sprawl of pine needles. And when she looked up to see Taza stifling a rare, crooked grin, the absurdity of it all. Being a bartered girl in Apache lands, her hair full of twigs, his face calm and unreadable, burst out of her in a sharp, clear laugh that echoed through the trees. For a moment, Taza just stared. And then, slowly, he laughed too. Not loud, not long, but real. And something between them shifted again. In the days that followed, the silence between them grew comfortable, almost companionable, and Clara began to mimic his hand signs for water, fire, and food, finding pride in every new thing she learned. One evening, as she helped skin a rabbit he'd caught, he watched her hands and said, "You are not weak." And though it wasn't a compliment in the usual way, it struck her deeper than any flattery ever had. But peace is fragile in a world built on pain. And it was broken the next day when they reached a small Apache village, nestled in a canyon bend. Women stared, some whispering behind their shawls, and an elder man approached Taza with words clipped and harsh. Clara stood back, unsure, but she caught enough to know the man didn't approve of her, that didn't believe she belonged. Taza responded evenly, but when the man gestured directly at Clara and spat on the ground, she flinched, her body folding inward out of old habit. She expected Taza to remain quiet as always, but instead, he stepped forward, jaw clenched, and spoke with such firm authority that even the elder stepped back. Clara didn't understand the words, but the effect was clear. Taza had claimed her, not as a burden, but as someone worth defending. That night, as they camped on the edge of the village, Clara sat by the fire and whispered, "Why do you keep doing that? Standing up for me?" And for a long time, he said nothing, just stirred the fire with a stick, until finally he murmured, Because no one stood for my sister either, and she broke. Clara looked at him then, truly saw him, and understood that they were both remnants of things others had discarded. But here, in the wild, their brokenness was beginning to fit together. They left the village at dawn, tension still clinging to Clara like the smoke from last night's fire. But Taza walked ahead with the same calm stride as always, his silence no longer cold, but thoughtful. For the first time, Clara felt less like a follower and more like a partner. She carried her own supplies, knew how to set traps, even recognized the call of a red-tailed hawk overhead. And Taza, though still sparing with words, began to look at her in ways that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a hope so unfamiliar it felt dangerous. Yet that fragile thread was tested when they stumbled upon a bloodied settler's wagon near the base of a ridge. Wheels splintered, one horse dead, the other limping with fear-matted flanks. Clara froze at the sight of the woman. Blonde, pale, bruised, clinging to a bloodied rifle and whispering prayers. Taza approached cautiously, but the woman shrieked at the sight of him, raising the rifle with shaking hands and screaming, "Don't touch me, savage!" before collapsing in tears. Clara stepped forward, hands raised, her voice soft as she said, "He's not going to hurt you, I promise." But the woman's blue eyes locked on her with confusion and betrayal. "You're with him?" she spat, as if Clara had become the traitor. They helped her anyway. Taza tended to her wounds while Clara coaxed the horse into calm. And by nightfall, the woman, whose name was Ruth, had stopped flinching at every movement, though her eyes still flicked to Taza with suspicion. That night, Clara sat apart, her heart churning with a shame she hadn't felt since leaving her father's house. A voice inside whispering that no matter how kind Taza was, to people like Ruth, he'd always be a monster. And by being at his side, Clara would be seen as monstrous too. When she finally dared ask Taza why he hadn't just left Ruth to die, he didn't look at her. He just said, "Because she is alone. You remember what alone feels like." And Clara did remember too well. But for the first time, she realized that walking beside a man like Taza meant choosing to live by a different kind of honor. Not the one written in books or shouted in town squares, but the quiet kind that only reveals itself when no one else is watching. Clara woke to the sound of hushed voices, Ruth's strained whisper cutting through the cool morning air, her words sharp with fear and disbelief. "You don't understand, he's Apache, they kill people like us," she was saying, and Clara stayed still, listening from behind the rocks where she'd gone to gather water, her heart sinking with every word. "He saved you," Clara said finally, stepping into view, her voice firm despite the tremble beneath it. "And he's done nothing but treat us both better than most white men ever have." Ruth flinched, caught, but didn't back down. "You weren't born out here," she hissed. "You don't know what they've done." Clara stared at her, 1,000 memories flashing behind her eyes. Her father's disgust, her stepmother's cruelty, the way even little children laughed at her like she didn't belong anywhere. And she said quietly, "No, I know what people do when they think someone's beneath them." Later, when they resumed their journey toward a nearby army outpost Ruth insisted existed, Clara walked a little further from Taza, guilt knotting in her chest. Not because she doubted him, but because she hated that part of her still feared how others would see them together. By midday, they reached the hilltop Ruth had described, and below, like a scar across the prairie, lay the rough wooden fences and tents of a small cavalry outpost. Clara's stomach turned. She'd dreamed of places like this as a girl, places with order and roofs and safety, but now they felt foreign. Ruth was greeted with immediate care. Soldiers rushing out with stretchers and questions, their eyes scanning Clara's dress and dirt-smudged face before settling, cold and hostile, on Taza. "Step back, savage," one barked, and when Clara opened her mouth to speak, another soldier grabbed her by the arm, muttering, "We'll get you home, miss. Don't worry, we'll handle him." Taza didn't resist, didn't speak, even as they forced him to the ground and bound his wrists, and Clara shouted, "Stop it, he's with me." But no one listened. The world that had always ignored her had finally noticed, but only to put her back in the box she'd spent her life escaping. As they dragged Taza toward a holding tent, he met her gaze with something unbroken. Not fear, not anger. Anger, but the same calm strength he'd shown since the night they met. And in that look, Clara understood. If she didn't fight for him now, she'd be no better than the father who gave her away. Clara stormed into the captain's tent with dust still clinging to her boots and fire in her voice, her fists clenched as she demanded, "Why is he being held?" But the officer, a grizzled man with deep lines around his mouth and whiskey on his breath, just looked up slowly and said, "Because he's Apache, miss, and that's reason enough in these parts." She could feel the blood drain from her face as the room spun, not with fear, but fury, and she slammed her hand on his desk, rattling a tin cup. "That man saved Ruth's life, he saved mine, and he's not a criminal." The captain didn't flinch, just leaned back and said coolly, "Maybe not, but we can't have him roaming free and scaring the womenfolk, now can we?" And that one sentence made something snap inside her. She marched out before she did something foolish, heart racing, and found Ruth seated by the fire pit, bandaged and freshly clothed, sipping tea like she hadn't just watched the man who saved her be shackled. "Say something," Clara begged, but Ruth looked away and muttered, "It's better this way. You'll be safe now." Clara stared, stunned, then whispered, "You were never the one in danger." That night, Clara found Taza kneeling in the holding tent, hands tied behind his back, his eyes calm even as bruises bloomed on his jaw. She dropped to her knees beside him and whispered, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought you here." And he gave a small shake of his head, murmuring, "You needed to see." And she did see now, saw that the world she'd once hoped would redeem her only wanted to cage her again, to mold her into something small and quiet, grateful to be saved by men who didn't see her worth unless it came wrapped in obedience. As she pressed her forehead to Taza's, tears finally falling, she made her choice. Not just to help him, but to walk away from every lie she'd been told about, who deserved to be loved, who deserved to be free. And as the stars blinked above, she whispered, "I won't let them keep you," and felt him exhale, like a man who had been holding his breath for far too long. Clara waited until the outpost grew still, until the men were drunk on their own righteousness, and the guards near the tent dozed with rifles slack in their arms, then moved like someone who had nothing left to lose, her heart pounding as she crept through the shadows to the storage shed she'd seen earlier. Inside, she found a rusted hatchet, a coil of rope, and a pair of bolt cutters left behind by some lazy quartermaster. And when she slipped them beneath her shawl, she didn't feel like a rescued girl or a fugitive's accomplice. She felt like herself, finally, fully, for the first time. Slipping into the tent, she knelt beside Taza, who didn't speak, just watched her with those still, knowing eyes. And when she snapped the chains from his wrists, he whispered, "If we run, they follow." But she shook her head, voice firm. "Then let them follow. We'll show them what strength really looks like." They moved fast, keeping to the tree line, her smaller frame darting ahead, clearing the way, while Taza, despite his bruises, kept pace, guiding them east toward a canyon he said the cavalry wouldn't dare enter. By dawn, they reached the ravine, its stone walls rising like sentinels, and for a moment, Clara collapsed to her knees, breath ragged, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of all she'd left behind. "They'll call me a traitor," she murmured, and Taza crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her dirt-streaked face, saying, "No, only those afraid of truth use that word." They traveled for 3 days, sleeping beneath rock outcroppings and eating what little Taza could catch. And though her feet blistered and her body ached, Clara never once thought of turning back. On the 4th morning, they arrived at a hidden clearing beside a crystal stream, where an old woman sat tending a small fire, her face weathered but kind. "Taza's aunt," he explained, "who once was shaman to their people." The woman looked at Clara without surprise, as if she'd been expecting her all along, and said softly in English, "You were not given, you were found." As they sat around the fire that night, the warmth chasing away the bite of fear, Clara looked at Taza and realized something simple, something terrifying. She loved him, not out of gratitude, not from desperation, but because in his silence and strength, he had taught her that worth was not something others assigned. It was something you claimed. The cavalry didn't forget. Not men like Captain Marsh, who saw defiance in any woman who didn't tremble and treason in any Apache who didn't bow. And when the search party found their tracks 2 weeks later, they came armed with vengeance disguised as law. Clara spotted them first from the ridge above the clearing. 5 soldiers on horseback, rifles gleaming, Ruth among them with her arm in a sling and her mouth tight as thread. She ran back to the fire where Taza and his aunt were preparing herbs, breathless, shouting, "They found us! 5 riders, maybe more behind them." And Taza stood slowly, not with panic, the tired kind of readiness, as if he'd always known peace couldn't last without a fight. "Go into the ravine," he told Clara. "You and my aunt, hide in the stone nest." But she grabbed his arm and shook her head, eyes fierce. "I'm not leaving you. If they take you again, they'll have to shoot me too." He looked at her, pain etched deep in his eyes, and whispered, "You should not die for me." But she answered, "Then you never understood. I'm not dying for you. I'm living for what you taught me." The confrontation happened just as the sun struck the clearing, Captain Marsh raising his rifle, Ruth calling out weakly, "Let the girl go! We can still help her!" But Clara stepped forward first, arms raised, voice loud and clear. "He's not your prisoner. He's my husband." The words hung heavy in the air, and though they had never spoken vows or shared a kiss, the claim was truth as raw and sacred as anything carved in stone. The soldiers paused, startled, unsure, and Taza stepped beside her, shoulders straight, head high, his presence a mountain behind her resolve. "You don't get to decide who I belong to," Clara said, her voice breaking but firm. "Not you, not my father, not this uniform. You gave me away because I was ugly, and he gave me back my life because he saw more than a face." Silence followed, then a voice from the back, a younger soldier muttering, "Let 'em be, sir. They ain't hurting anyone." Ruth looked down, shamed, and the captain's mouth twitched, furious but cornered. He finally spat on the ground and barked, "This ain't over," then turned his horse around, the others falling in behind. Clara didn't move until the dust cleared, and then, slowly, she turned to Taza, her hand reaching for his. And in that moment, they were no longer fugitives or outcasts, but 2 souls who had stood the world down and won. The seasons turned, and with each sunrise in the hidden canyon, Clara shed pieces of the girl she had once been. The girl who flinched at mirrors, who swallowed her words, who thought love was something earned by pleasing, cruel men. Under Taza's quiet steadiness and his aunt's gentle wisdom, she learned how to heal herbs, weave fishnets, track elk, and read the changes in the wind. Not because she needed to survive, but because she wanted to belong. And belonging here didn't mean changing who she was, only recognizing what had always been inside her. She and Taza never spoke of marriage again, but they planted corn together, shared stories beside the fire, and when Clara touched his face, it was with a reverence that needed no ceremony to sanctify it. Once, she caught her reflection in the creek. Cheek sunburned, hands calloused, hair wild, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She saw strength, defiance, and a kind of beauty that no town could ever understand. Travelers came now and then, Apache cousins, traders, even a lone priest who nodded politely and didn't ask questions, and word of their stand against the cavalry spread in whispers, not as scandal, but as legend. Some called her mad, others brave, but Clara didn't care. She hadn't chosen Taza to prove anything to the world, only to herself. And in his arms, she found a truth that no sermon, no law, no bloodline had ever offered. That to be loved without conditions is the rarest gift a person can receive. When her father died, unmourned, bitter, alone, Clara felt no satisfaction, only a quiet release, like the final breath after a long-held pain. She marked the day by planting wildflowers near the stream, not for him, but for the girl she used to be, the one he couldn't break no matter how hard he tried. And as she watched the petals dance in the wind, Taza came up behind her, wrapping her in the same blanket he'd once offered by the fire that first night, and whispered, "No one will ever give you away again." Clara leaned into him, eyes closed, and smiled, not because everything had healed, but because the parts that mattered had grown back stronger, rooted in love, and finally, fully, hers. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.